Behold, my final form, a car theist. Really, it's just too damn windy outside and I have a bit of a cold, so. But regardless, welcome to the finale of this little trilogy. And boys, have been a hell of a ride. So allow me to give you all a brief recap. I was raised Protestant, my family is now Eastern Orthodox, they converted when I was an adult, and I didn't really have a good experience with Christianity growing up. I became an atheist when I was 15, and through my philosophical studies, I came to a place a few years ago where I could accept the concept of the Logos. I mean, there has to be some kind of consistent logic keeping things going, right? That was a few years ago, and I treated the Logos as God. This is the point where I realized that I need some sleep, so I picked up the video again later. This video is brought to you in part by my mosquito friends. That was a few years ago, and I treated the Logos as God, even though I neither believed it to be sentient nor the creator of anything. About a month ago, I played around with more of a pantheistic worldview, and facilitated a space to directly commune with the divine via a mushroom trip. A lower dose than I had taken in years, mind you. And when I did that, I had a religious experience, where I thought I had received a divine edict from the utmost divine consciousness. Quit cigars. There was no imperative, but it was, what I deemed to be, the most perfect decision I could make at that time. I told my family of my divine encounter, and they got me an invite to an Orthodox monastery. This is when I made my last video, where I took stock of my beliefs and grounded myself before the visit because I felt my brain was pretty scrambled after my entire worldview had been subverted. My sanity was hanging on by a thread considering how quickly everything was happening. I was having trouble computing reality. This was a complicated time, so to keep it brief, I was seeing symbols and patterns in literally everything. Because if God exists, everything happens for a reason, right? There are no coincidences, right? Every stubbed toe, every sniffle, every backfiring car, I attributed significance to it. Narratives are a hell of a drug. Before going to the monastery, I had to accept that there must be coincidences in life. Not everything happens for a reason, as a part of some grand narrative. Some things simply are. I had to accept the fact that I had become drunk on symbols. I think I was clinging to that trippy mindset because I thought I was slowly losing my belief in God again. What if it was just mushrooms? They do significantly heighten one's pattern recognition, and I did go into it looking for another consciousness. So I went to the monastery, had a pleasant time, made the most of my situation, relayed essentially what I broadcasted in the last video to a monk, and he recommended to me a book, God's Revelation to the Human Heart by Seraphim Rose. On my last day at the monastery, my eyes were wandering over the bookshelf in my cabin and a specific tome caught my eye. It was on the Shroud of Turin. Now, immediately I thought, perhaps this is a sign, and started looking through it because one of the comments on my last video cited the Shroud of Turin as a key reason the commenter had become baptized. I did some research on it before the monastery and thought it was a hoax, but for this book to catch my eye, well, perhaps I was too hasty to dismiss it, right? Long story short, I walked away from the book even less convinced of its veracity. I mean, the weaving technique on the shroud wouldn't even exist for hundreds of years. I read God's revelation to the human heart as soon as I returned home because I want to be open-minded, right? I want the truth, right? A lot of it was how God knows the cracks in everyone's heart, and where the exact amount of pressure needs to be applied at the exact time. To be honest, I was moved by some of the passages, particularly when he described some of the miracles, like a hospitalized woman crying out for Archbishop John Maximovich to give her communion during a storm where absolutely no communication was possible. But he came to her bedside, gave her confession and communion, and left. The nurses didn't believe her, but the patient in the bed next to her claimed that she did have a visitor. And under her pillow was a $20 American bill, which was what was customary of the Archbishop to leave her with after his lessons. Now, when I read passages like that, my first instinct is to give the benefit of the doubt, because what if it was one of my Orthodox friends or family members that had that experience in that hospital? Who am I to say it didn't happen? There's another passage where Solzhenitsyn was in the gulags, and while there are some atheists who refused to cave to torture, they always ended up bitter and angry, whereas the Christians who endured torture would often end up showing love and compassion for their tormentors. This is significant to me. This sounds like the kind of fruit I would imagine the one true religion yielding, but my head was reeling, because something didn't feel right. It hit on some emotional notes for me, true, and those should not be discounted, but I still just wasn't convinced. I started to gaslight myself a bit. Were demons warring over my soul? I reorganized my thoughts and experiences, and I just couldn't make that leap because not only have there been so many religions and civilizations before Judaism, let alone Christianity, But also, the God of the Bible is anything other than perfect or omnibenevolent, a far cry from what I see in Orthodoxy. I continued to gaslight myself. Perhaps Orthodoxy was the one true religion, but I just wasn't looking at it the right way. After all, those people in the gulags who showed such love and fortitude, surely that points to something divine, right? Those miracles I had heard and read about, surely there isn't a naturalistic explanation for all those experiences, right? Thing is, I learned Seraphim Rose, while perhaps the most brilliant Christian I've ever read, was not infallible, and had some out there beliefs not even in line with orthodoxy. Eastern Orthodoxy itself, while its consistency is its strength, is also its weakness when it comes to people like me. Mother Thecla, for example, was called equal to the apostles, renowned in orthodoxy. Well, the earliest manuscript of her is actually a guy saying the presbyter who first circulated the story admitted to its fabrication. Even the Catholics, for all their bullshit, recognized she probably didn't exist and removed her from their canon. Only orthodoxy still reveres her as if she existed, as if her story was true, because that is how they've always done things. And I found a bunch of other stuff that kind of solidified for me that even if Christianity is the truest religion, Orthodoxy is not the one true church. I realized I'd perhaps become too hasty and gone off the deep end. I needed to reassess my religious experience. So, after nearly losing my damn mind, I think I'm back in reality again. Here are my findings after some very deep and intense introspection. What I had was indeed a religious experience, but I need to recognize that at the end of the day, I was on mushrooms, which drastically increase one's pattern recognition. One thing I neglected to mention in my other videos is that I wasn't just on mushrooms. I smoked a Native American herbal blend and took a few hits off a really strong infused joint. Since my last video, I've had to quit weed because not only had I become reliant on it, but also it increases my anxiety and paranoia. Every time I gaslit myself with questions if I was actually being intellectually honest about Christianity, do you know what else I was lighting myself with? And so, isn't it curious that at the height of my weed addiction, when my paranoia was at its greatest, and I was in an isolated period while I wrote my novel, I started to feel a little disconnected from humanity, from the people in my own household. This is when I adopted a more pantheistic worldview so that I could be a little closer. But I wasn't quite convinced of an overarching consciousness, so I had that trip to see if I couldn't lift the veil a bit. I took that trip out of lawning and paired it with another substance that made me paranoid. I went looking for another consciousness and took a cocktail of substances that pretty much assured I would find it. Of course, I was struck with fear and awe and sacrificed my favorite hobby to what might be the most supreme intellect of reality. But was it really? I no longer think I communicated with a separate consciousness, at least not one like ours. I put that on that experience. But I did essentially commune with God. I communed with the spirit of the Logos. Let me explain it this way. Many of the ancients, when they worshipped love deities like Freya or Aphrodite, were not appealing to a disembodied consciousness, but to the spirit of love. We have a conception of something, like love, therefore it has a spirit of some kind. The ancients appealed to the spirits of love, justice, etc., and personified them as deities, as something more comprehensible to direct one's intentions towards. Intentions are a powerful thing, and we don't fully understand everything that goes into them. I mean, just look at the experiments run with plants in the exact same conditions where one was insulted over a month while the other was praised, and the insulted plant withered. I've observed our thoughts make ripples in time and space, like stretched skin makes micro tears. Our intentions during certain states must leave some kind of impression on reality. We're getting into territory that's better for other videos, so I'm keeping it brief, but this would explain many miracles over many religions. Like pagans appealed to spirits of certain concepts and directed their intentions to certain effects, I believe this forms a basis for things like miracles to occur in Christianity. I mean, Jesus is essentially a love deity, is he not? Just not one like the pagans before him really ever had. So I essentially communed with the spirit of the Logos. Maybe it was conscious, aware of my being, maybe it wasn't. But the fact remains. Quitting cigars at that moment was logical, the timing was perfect, and it was in line with the four cardinal virtues. I mean, it was wise to do so, it was just, I gave them up so I could more effectively get my transformational novel out, it was an act of temperance, and it took courage. I literally communed with the spirit of the Logos. Does that mean I talked to an almighty personal creator, though? No, there's no indication of such a thing except for maybe how the weather shifted in response. I could put it down to heightened pattern recognition, but for all I know, it could have also been nature spirits or Gaia talking to me. I cannot know for certain, and I don't need to. The Logos might as well be God to me. I've treated it as such for years, and it's the closest thing I've really ever gotten to a belief in God in the last decade. Call me a deist, call me a pantheist, I don't really care about labels at this point. I suppose I believe in God, but it's certainly not most people's conception of God, I don't think. I've strained myself trying to find a personal deity, and I just haven't found it. I believe reality is absurd, as in, there are some things that don't make sense I don't think we'll ever understand, like is matter infinitely divisible or finitely divisible? Reality is full of these kinds of paradoxes, and yet there's something that's keeping our perceived reality consistent. That consistency is the Logos. If I got anything out of that trip, it was a belief in pneuma. I'll make a separate video on this, but to summarize, the most basic motion of reality is input and output, cause and effect. The breath, the pneuma. In order for the pneuma to exist, there must be a logos to facilitate it, something stable. If there was no pneuma, there would merely be existence without motion. Life would not be possible, stars would not exist. This combination of logos and its breath, pneuma, is what I consider to be God. Logos is the body, pneuma is the blood and the breath. The pneuma is what I consider to be the basis for animism, and therefore spirituality. It transcends the material and encompasses it. After that trip, I've become much more receptive to spirituality, because I think I can finally reconcile it with my hyper-rationalistic mind. Some would consider me to still be an atheist, and by their definition, sure, but I think that's a pretty narrow view of God. Just because a God might be indifferent to our existence doesn't make it any less real, particularly since I can now define and point to something and call it God. This little journey started out of paranoia and self-delusion, but I think I've been able to cut away the fat and keep what's important. I think I've concluded I take this life too damn seriously. I had a cigar after writing this script just this morning. Just one more until I get my novel out. Not as an act of hubris, but so I know I'm not living in fear anymore. I'll stick to weed socially, but that paranoia is the last thing I need when I'm alone right now. Am I a little embarrassed by the other videos in the trilogy? Sure, but I think it can serve as an interesting case study for some people, so I'm leaving them up. Not going to be putting out much content for a while because it's peak season at work right now, but there is more to come. Believe that. But here's to temperance. Be sure to smash that dislike button and leave your cruelest comment down below. Farewell. Oh, and I'm releasing part 1 of my novel on Substack right now. Link will be in the description below. It starts off pretty brutal, but the payoff is worth it. Enjoy.